Thanks, Alan. Well, Bernie has set up the foundations for this workshop, I think, extremely well. What I would like to do in the next few minutes is talk about how to enhance the development of novel medical products and apply them in the clinical setting from the point of view of the academic-industry relationship. Alan suggested that I did develop our industry relations policy. I did. It's now undergone its 4th or 5th or 6th revision, and we continue to talk about it. It's an evolving process, and one that I think this group has a lot of interest in and can help us think through how to address the challenges. Let me start by saying I don't have any financial disclosures or conflicts of interest, but I am a practicing clinician, and I am a vice dean of a school of medicine, and these issues are critical to everyday interactions that I have with faculty, with staff, and in my own clinical practice. So these issues are really critical to all of us, and we all have perspectives that we bring to the table and some conflicts that are probably not recognized. On this slide, I just show a diagrammatic relationship of where we are, at least at UCSF, with respect to thinking about some of these issues. And this slide emphasizes the issues from the point of view of precision or personalized medicine, but just looking at some of the complicated relationships, again, as Bernie suggested, emphasizing the importance of thinking about the patient's family, and the personal issues that are confronted by these industry-academic relationships, and also the complexities now of thinking about personalized and precision medicine. And if you remember in Bernie's slide, he shows how many different drugs need to be evaluated before one comes to market. If you now think about marketing drugs that are specific to many subpopulations, actually, instead of bringing one drug to market, we may need to bring 10 or 12 drugs to market, and that increases the complexity and increases some of the challenges associated not only with the conflicts but also with the science involved in bringing those products to market. The other parties in all of this are obviously the clinicians caring for the patients and their relationship with the patient, which creates all sorts of conflicts in terms of how they make their money, how their patient base needs to be managed, how the institution is holding them accountable for providing cost-effective care, but how they also relate to their scientific colleagues and to industry and the PhD candidates, postdocs, and others who are working on new product development. So it just emphasizes that this is a very challenging and very competitive environment for which we need to think about creative solutions that are beyond the traditional ones that we have put in place over the past 10 or 12 years as we've addressed these issues. And I think Bernie talked a little bit about that challenge and the fact that there are both real and what people call perceived conflicts. The perception is in the mind of the beholder. If a patient believes that I have a conflict and I don't, does that make the conflict real? It is to the patient. It clearly is to my decision making. We need to think about the ownership of intellectual property and what intellectual property really means with respect to these issues, and autonomy and academic freedom. And I put academic in quotes here because academic traditionally thinks about my academic freedom as a faculty member. I really want to talk about autonomy and controlling my environment from a scientific perspective, from a clinical perspective, and an administrative perspective, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And then I want to go on and talk about some of the opportunities, the ways in which I think we can manage the conflicts, perceived and real, and create new models for the industry-academic relationship. This is a cartoon I put together some time ago that is only here to emphasize the complexity. There is a patient here with genetic profiles, environmental issues, comorbid conditions that an individual clinician is trying to care for, and there are lots of other people that are trying to help solve the problem. And it creates incredible sources of conflict and incredible difficulties and challenges in the relationships, made only more complicated by the fact that a lot of the research activities are funded by the National Institutes of Health and industry, and that each of these organizations have influence over the process and have their own conflicts, their own goals, their own challenges associated with these issues. And so we need to think very carefully about how we build these relationships. So let me talk about this from the point of view of each of these participants in the relationship and where I think we can build some new ways of interacting. First of all, from the faculty perspective, I think it's very important to recognize that the faculty do have conflicts and they have multiple missions, and they get incredible mixed messages from the public, from their institutions, from their friends and family, as well as from regulators. The goal for a faculty member is to create, and most importantly, to disseminate new knowledge and to secure extramural research funding, not only to support their research activities, but to support the infrastructure of the institutions. This is becoming an increasing challenge, particularly as our institutions are struggling with their infrastructures and need to rebuild them, and we need to think about alternative models that may actually facilitate this. Most academicians, most deans of medical schools will say that the indirect cost recovery does not cover the costs of doing research and that it costs us money every time we get an NIH grant. We can argue that at another workshop. But the reality is that the infrastructure needs to be maintained and we need to work collaboratively. We need to commercialize these advances. The goal is to take better care of patients. That commercialization creates conflicts and creates challenges and opportunities as well. We need to transfer the knowledge. We want to create new businesses. Some faculty are very entrepreneurial. Most institutions are very entrepreneurial and want to help create new businesses to help foster the intellectual environment. And we want to utilize the technology to benefit the patients, which is our first and foremost goal. At the same time, we're told to avoid all conflicts. Conflicts of interest as well as conflicts of commitment. And the conflict of commitment is to be a faculty member. Guess what? Faculty are supposed to be teaching. I can tell you at the University of California, the legislature believes that it is supporting teaching. All of the state dollars, and there aren't very many state dollars, coming to the University of California, at least UCSF, are supporting the research mission. They're supporting the faculty doing the research to provide them with the basic support that allows them to then spend their time doing pilot projects to be able to demonstrate that the science is worthy of extramural funding. And the teaching mission somehow gets lost in all of this. So it does become a challenge with respect to the role of a faculty member. They're supposed to protect their own intellectual property and that of the university. I've talked about the need to support and ensure academic freedom. And oh, by the way, be transparent about this and report all of your potential and real conflicts. Well, I know my real conflicts. I know my definition of my potential conflicts, but I don't know your definition of my potential conflicts. So how do I disclose what I don't recognize as a conflict? This is a big issue. This is just a figure from a recent article in the New England Journal that looked at the payout to physicians in Massachusetts from industry. And the numbers are huge. I will show you in cardiology, the total value is over $8 million. That's cardiologists in the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Multiply that by 50 states of various sizes, and the numbers are very real. So these issues are quite important. So we say, in the name of disclosure, let's be transparent. I don't need to go into some of the challenges of the transparency argument because Bernie has done that very effectively, but the reality is that it is very difficult to disclose the relationships. I have to disclose in a number of different capacities, and each of my disclosures is different. The requirements are different, what I disclose is different, and if I showed you all of those, you'd say, I must be lying. I must be covering something up, because they're all from very different perspectives, and I'm not sure they're providing any incredible value to patients or to the public at large. The other issue is that in most universities, faculty are allowed to do some activities outside of their role in the faculty, and to benefit from those. And the limits may vary from one department to another, one institution to another. But those external versus internal relationships become very important in thinking about what I have to disclose and how I disclose it and to whom under the circumstances in which I'm working. This is not an easy problem, and the disclosures are challenging. I would say Penny Pritzker, in her role as Secretary-elect for the Department of Commerce, just had a clerical error of $80 million reporting. Now, we can argue why that was and the source for that error, but the reality is I've probably had some errors in my reporting. I guarantee it's not $80 million. In fact, it's probably not financial at all. But the issue is still the same, and I think it's really important to think about what it is we expect people to disclose and why, and most importantly, how we interpret this. How am I to interpret this lack of disclosure? Does that make her a non-credible candidate for Secretary of Commerce? Someone has to decide. Congress will. But the reality is that it is challenging. Let me now look at this from a different perspective. Let me look at it from the institutional perspective. The institutions clearly are conflicted, independent of the individual investigators or the faculty academic relationships. We have conflicts of mission, and I've discussed those previously. We are supposed to be institutions of higher education. We are educating, but we are also doing science. We are creating new products. We are working for the public good in a whole variety of ways. We have social commitments and other obligations to the community at large, and some of those missions are in conflict. For those academic institutions that are healthcare institutions, we also have our commitment to our individual patients, our community of patients, and the community at large. At the same time, we are expected to create and disseminate new knowledge. The dissemination is a critical part of the academic mission. I can't create knowledge and hold it to myself. I need to open it up to public scrutiny, but I also need to disseminate it for public good. The academic standing of institutions clearly creates controversies and challenges and conflicts. The academic standing in terms of NIH ranking is critically important. We have multiple celebrations when a department increases their NIH funding and increases their stature. We as an institution look very closely at the NIH standings and analyze them in great detail to determine how we can move forward in that endeavor. Does that create conflicts? Does that create challenges for us? I think it may. In addition, the U.S. News and World Reports creates incredible challenges for us to look at how we can move higher in the standings because it has financial as well as other benefits to the institution. And these are critically important to every academic institution. I've talked about the intellectual property issues. The royalty issues are critically important to institutions. Philanthropy is important, and naming opportunities. I have a picture here of the first building that was built on our Mission Bay campus. It is called Genentech Hall. Anybody know why it's called Genentech Hall? It's actually as a result of a settlement. It's not as a result of a gift by Genentech to the University of California. But I can tell you that there are lots of medical students and residents who have tried to tear the sign down, who feel that it is compromising our role and our mission by having a building, a very prominent building on our campus named after a company. That company was developed by UCSF and Stanford investigators who have provided incredible support to the University of California and to Stanford University. And our chancellor happens to have been an employee of Genentech prior to becoming chancellor. Does that create conflicts? Are those real or perceived? And outreach efforts. I think the reason I bring this up is that I think institutions are held less accountable than individuals in this process, and I think we need to step back and look at the role all of us have. Let me just show you the royalty issue. Universities profit incredibly from breakthroughs. I talked about some of the issues we talk about all the time, like NIH ranking. We also talk about royalty income coming to the university. Just to show you the impact, Northwestern University led the nation in royalty income in 2011, $191 million. A lot of money. It helps support the academic mission. It helps build the infrastructure of the institution, but it clearly creates challenges. Industry has conflicts. Industry obviously wants to control its intellectual property, but we've talked about developing pre-competitive collaborations and other sorts of relationships that now make it much more difficult to control that intellectual property in the traditional ways that we have, and we need to think differently about what it means to control that and manage the intellectual property. Bernie talked about the high cost of product development, the regulatory burdens, and as I've suggested previously, the investigators and the companies also want their own academic freedom and autonomy and scientific integrity to commercialize their advances, but also to advance the careers of their investigators. They also want to publish, and they want to be credible participants in the academic environment from an industry perspective. That changes the complexion of the relationship. And finally, I don't think that we can ignore the conflicts and potential challenges associated with government agencies, commercial payers, and health plans, all of which are participants, and I don't need to belabor those points. All of that said, there are many people who believe there should be no relationship between industry and academics. Medical students and residents have organizations dedicated to this mission. They truly believe, not understanding the consequences, that the relationship between industry and academics should be cut, and that it compromises the integrity of everything we do. Robbie Pearl, who is the CEO of Kaiser Permanente, is quoted as saying, "Patients will continue to be at risk for potential harm until physicians themselves stop participating in relationships with industry." Maybe easy for a Kaiser physician to say, because Kaiser is not a big participant in some of the important aspects of healthcare, my bias. It's clearly a conflict from my perspective, but I think it represents a very narrow-minded view of the relationship between the physician in the Kaiser setting and their patients. Does that mean they should not participate in clinical trials? That's how I would interpret this. I think you can extend this to the point where it is ludicrous, and it makes no sense. David Sawich, in a recent Atlantic Monthly article, said, "We're taught to distrust the physicians and university researchers who consult the most with industry, yet it's often these experts who are the smartest scientists and the most experienced clinicians." So he goes on to say there's a way to cultivate, not demonize, collaboration between physicians, and he said pharma, I'm saying industry more broadly. And I think that's where I want to go in the next few minutes. How do we enhance this academic-industry interaction, minimize the risks, define the right balance between collaboration, coordination, and competition, and create some new ways of thinking about this model? And I don't want to suggest that I have the solution or that UCSF has a solution. I think we're all struggling with this, but the goal is to stand back and look at this whole issue differently and think about how we can establish the relationships more effectively. First of all, as Bernie has suggested, and I think you'll hear through the day today, we need to address and confront these conflicts. They are real. They need to be clarified. They need to be defined from the point of view of each of the individual parties and what they mean, particularly to our patients and our community at large. We need to define a mechanism to make them transparent, but do so responsibly, and we need to create new models. So let me deal with the conflict issue. As Bernie suggested, we need to acknowledge the conflicts, but we also need to define what the conflicts are. And I don't think it is important to differentiate real and perceived conflicts. If someone perceives there is a conflict, it is a conflict, and we need to then figure out how to address it. We then need to manage the conflicts. And we need to understand that the primary goal is to protect human subjects. Our primary goal is to get new technology, new knowledge, new drugs to patients and do so effectively in a way that is responsible, recognizing that there will in fact be conflicts that have to be managed during that process. Clearly, there has to be a mechanism to disclose those conflicts and make them transparent. It's important to understand the economic relationships, but there are other relationships that also need to be understood. We had a faculty member who was funded by a company to do research. There was a contract between the university and the company stopped paying their bill. We found out that the CEO of the company, when the contract was signed, was the husband of the investigator that was doing the investigations, not disclosed. He is no longer the CEO of the company for reasons that are unclear to me. But he is no longer the CEO of the company. The company is not willing to fulfill its obligation. The CEO, husband, has said he is willing to write a check to the university to cover that deficit as a donation, which he can then take as a tax write-off. Clearly, disclosure in this case didn't work because the faculty member did not disclose the relationships, and it was very clear. On the other hand, the disclosure requirements, as we've suggested, are challenging. And so it creates this critical imbalance between trying to do the right thing and trying to ensure that science is perceived and pursued in an appropriate way. At the same time, it's really important for us, as Bernie suggested, and I hope others will suggest through the day today, to document the critical value of the collaboration, to not let conflicts prevent us from doing the right thing for patients. Now, how we do that is something that I hope we'll debate through the day today, but it's critically important to recognize that all of the drugs that I use in my clinical practice, all of the technology I apply to my patients has come out of industry academic collaborations. I've done some of the research myself. I've worked with other faculty who are doing the research. I've been involved in clinical trials, and that relationship is absolutely critical to making advances. At the same time, some of those advances have been demonstrated not to benefit patients. Where did I go wrong? Where did our relationship go wrong? We need to determine. But the reality is that all of the advances and the reasons that I can take care of patients today the way I can is as a result of those relationships, and we shouldn't forget that in our message. As Bernie suggested, we also need to create a single template using standard definitions. That will be very difficult because the purposes are very different. My disclosures for a continuing education course to my colleagues is very different than a disclosure I have to make to a patient. or a disclosure I have to make to my institution. So how we do that, the time frames in which we do that become critically important. Is it a calendar year? Is it a fiscal year? Is it 3 years? Is it 1 year? Is it an ongoing obligation? Every time I have a potential or perceived conflict or a real conflict that I have to disclose that in real time, then it requires that I recognize perceived and unintended conflicts that I may or may not recognize. And finally, I think it's really important as part of this process of disclosure is to disclose it in an informed way to the parties that need to know, in most cases to patients. And that's incredibly challenging. If I invented a hip prosthesis for a patient and I'm making a lot of money from that hip, and I tell a patient, I invented this hip and I think it's the right hip for you, what do you think the patient's going to say? I can tell you what our patients say. Fantastic, I've come to the expert. Use that hip. Is that the right prosthesis for that patient? It depends. It's the right prosthesis for that patient by that surgeon, but if that patient went to a different surgeon, would a different surgeon recommend a different prosthesis? And would that be an unconflicted recommendation? These are really difficult decisions with respect to not only disclosing, but interpreting the disclosure in a way that allows patients, families, the community at large to make the right decisions, recognizing the balance of the conflict versus benefit to the patient and to society. So with respect to these reporting requirements, Bernie suggested that the Sunshine Act will go into place and public reporting will occur in 2014. For those of you who are involved in public reporting of outcome measures and core measures for hospitals, think about how effective those have been in changing patient behavior. Remarkably unsuccessful. For all sorts of reasons, some of them unrelated to the conflicts, related to my health plan, related to my community, related to my options. But the reality is, I can look at every hospital's history and outcome after heart surgery if I need heart surgery, but how do I make a decision? Is it that public disclosure that makes a difference? The Sunshine Act is designed to help patients make informed decisions and discourage financial relationships that inflate healthcare costs. Well, think about this. It's clearly important to help patients make informed decisions. Are they thinking about inflating healthcare costs? They're thinking about getting good care. So does this disclosure to patients of my financial relationships do anything to impact healthcare costs? I question the assumption. On the other hand, I think it's critically important to have a disclosure process. It mandates disclosure for all transfers of value to physicians and teaching hospitals from $10. Now think about what I showed you before with respect to the money received by cardiologists in Massachusetts, and they're not unique. $8 million. So if I get $10 and the cardiologist gets $8 million, how do you evaluate that disclosure process and its impact on decision-making, much less on inflation of healthcare costs? Compliance is going to be expensive, and the public reporting, as I said, goes into place in 2014. Well, does disclosure work? I've already suggested that it doesn't work really well. The goal is to have public reporting to try and allow the public to understand the relationships, to provide useful information. My message is that that has to be done very carefully, and the message is the critical piece of this. Patient decision-making is not always influenced by the disclosure alone, and it may not even be able to be influenced by disclosure alone if that patient happens to have a plan that requires that that patient see that individual physician. So the health plan may be dictating that the patient see the physician that is conflicted, even if the physician discloses that conflict, and the patient chooses or would have chosen under other circumstances to see a different provider. As Bernie suggested, and I want to reiterate, it's difficult to differentiate the desirable from the undesirable implications of the disclosure. And it's really important to understand that. Reporting alone misrepresents the nature and the value of the relationship. Doesn't mean reporting is not important, doesn't mean we shouldn't report, but it must be kept in context. And figuring out how to translate that context to something meaningful for patients and for Senator Grassley and others becomes critically important. I think Senator Grassley agrees with some of our medical students and residents that we should have no relationship. And that is, I think, naive and underrepresents the value to Medicare recipients and to the public that he is trying to protect. And I share his concern for protecting the public, but I'm not sure we're going about it the right way. So let's move beyond that, because I think a lot of the discussion will continue with respect to those issues. And let me talk a little bit about some of the creative alternatives that I think we can develop and that are critically important for us to develop. We need to break down the silos between industry and academics. We've talked about a lot of the relationships, but the reality is we do function in parallel. And we're trying to build those bridges, but it is challenging. Pre-competitive collaboration, which has been the source of multiple discussions at the IOM and multiple workshops, is one way of doing that, and it's critically an important way of doing it. But the definition of pre-competitive was probably the most important part of those discussions. At what point do we diverge from a pre-competitive collaborative relationship to one in which we can diverge and each benefit from our own individual participation in that pre-competitive relationship? Open innovation research networks, compound libraries, screening facilities, personnel sharing are critically important. We have developed a number of incubators within UCSF that are autonomous organizations but have the ability to understand what others are doing in the organization between industry and academics and allows a fairly open communication and a sieve-like relationship back and forth between PhDs, postdocs, and others to be able to work collaboratively and define the relationships very carefully. And then we need to manage the relationships, negotiate master agreements, define oversight structures, share credit for discovery, because the academic credit, the publication rights, and so forth are critically important in these relationships, and share the financial risks and benefits. This is a cartoon model that shows how to build some of those relationships, having a strategic planning board that defines strategic goals, a coordinating committee that helps coordinate activities, and most importantly, providing oversight of the academic industry relationships by an advisory board that includes external review and public members to help bring some context to this and to address the issues in a thoughtful way from the perspective of outside of the organization, looking inside the organization to figure out where there are risks, benefits, and alternatives to the structure that might more effectively manage the process. So let me just finish up by giving you a couple examples of some of the things that are happening at UCSF, some of which you're aware of and some of which you may not be. The Athena project is one that I know many of you are aware of with respect to breast cancer and looking at ways to accelerate drug development, recognizing what I said about the drug development process now. It's different. The development of a drug for a large community of patients is different than the development of a drug focused on personal needs of an individual patient based on their gene profile, their response to drugs, etc. The markets are now much smaller, making it very difficult for industry to develop products that are commercially viable, and yet that's the only way we're going to make further advances. So it's critically important to look at ways to accelerate the drug development and think about whether the markets are reasonable, and we've done so and are continuing to do so in the Athena project. We're looking at lung cancer and small cell carcinoma of the lung and some innovative therapies. This has required a relationship with other countries that have larger databases than the US. So this has involved a lot of investigators and huge databases in China, where the numbers dwarf us by many-fold. I was recently in Beijing. There is a hospital there that has 1,500 beds. They do 10,000 open heart cases a year and 15,000 angioplasties and caths a year. There isn't a hospital in the US that comes close, including the Cleveland Clinic. If we add them all together, we do about that number. Technology. We are the home of fetal surgery, and a lot of the fetal surgery development has required close relationships with industry. It started out in a very primitive way with literally our surgeons going to Europe and bringing devices back that were not approved for use in patients and trying to use them in patients. Obviously not the way to go, but has evolved into a structure that allows for more rapid implementation of instrumentation that can facilitate the care of fetuses with congenital anomalies, and some interesting magnetic applications for treatment of pectus excavatum and bowel anastomoses or reanastomoses, where the magnets pull the bowel together and then allow the bowel to recannulate, requiring close collaboration with industry. We've developed a faculty industry research consulting program designed to balance the autonomy of the individual faculty member and allowing consultation outside of the university with the needs of the university and industry, and making the university a party to the agreement that changes the relationship and provides some oversight of the relationship, but also puts some risks on the part of the institution, the university, industry, and the faculty member. The goal is to lower the barrier to partnership and to serve as a mechanism to identify investigators who may not be known to industry that may actually facilitate new product development. Ideally, it ensures compliance with regulatory and legal requirements and university policy, and hopefully, if the structure is set up correctly, it protects intellectual property of the various parties. It clearly is designed to uphold the academic mission and to provide a level of oversight that ensures ongoing collaboration. Finally, we are developing what's being called D-Health innovation to look at public-private partnerships between the university and industry to facilitate development, manufacture, and commercialization of products. Focuses on developing standards-based open platforms for data exchange, but also, in order to gain the data, development of instrumentation that provides the data to the infrastructure to be able to more effectively foster clinical and translational research. And one of the examples is Health e-Heart study, which is essentially designed to be the 2020 equivalent of the Framingham trial, with increased power and much shorter time. By developing a social media-based clinical trials and therapeutic management platform that utilizes devices, some of which are not yet developed, but will be developed by industry in response to the clinical need, to monitor patients continuously, be able to bring data back to the institution to allow us to more effectively understand patients, build specimen banks with blood samples, and relate the clinical data to the findings on the blood samples, and potentially to improve the delivery of health both within the hospital and within the community at large. So let me finish up by saying that I think the key to enhancing product development and facilitating the academic-industry relationships is to maintain a commitment to our core values of the institution, core values of the faculty, core values of industry, and core values of the community, to acknowledge the value and critical importance of the academic-industry relationships, not to undermine it, to manage it, but understand that it provides the core infrastructure for us to make advances in clinical care. To identify and manage the conflicts, ensure transparency with a reasonable standard way of communicating the conflicts so that each individual who wants to participate in the discussion understands the conflicts and can determine whether they influence how they make decisions or might influence the decisions that they make, and develop new models for collaboration that can be successful, that don't undermine the integrity of the science and the public trust, but do so in a thoughtful and responsible way. Thank you.
Neal, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. Our final stage setter this morning is Sally Rockey. Dr. Rockey is the NIH Deputy Director for Extramural Research. Her role oversees the development and implementation of the critical policies and guidelines central to the successful conduct of NIH-supported research and such, and therefore she touches this topic probably more than she ever dreamed she would, and we're delighted that you're with us today.